A good morning from IISS in Washington, D.C., and a warm welcome to today's webinar on security, development, and negotiations responding to jihadist insurgencies in Sub Saharan Africa. My name is Benjamin Petrini. I'm a research fellow here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I focus on Sub Saharan Africa, working in a program on conflict research, conflict security, and development. Our program monitors armed conflicts globally and areas of instability. We analyze some of the most important dynamics, including the responses to conflict and fragility, the geopolitical implications that are becoming more and more important for armed conflict, and the dynamics and proliferation of non-state armed groups. Our team curates the IISS yearly flagship publication on armed conflict survey, and we're currently preparing the 2023 edition, which will come out in early December. I'm particularly glad to introduce and moderate this webinar today, as it marks the launch of a new webinar series that we introduce on non-state armed groups. Non-state armed groups include a wide range of armed actors like domestic insurgencies, transnational groups, violent extremists, local militias, and criminal groups. There has been a proliferation of these groups at the global level during the last decade. It is estimated that nearly 200 million individuals globally live under some form of control by non-state armed groups. The violence of between non-state armed groups has skyrocketed in the last 10 years. Now, this webinar today focuses on the responses in terms of security, development, and diplomacy to the threat of jihadists in Sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, we will talk about three issues. First, the recent evolution of jihadist insurgencies on the continent, with lots of references to the Sahel, and we will try to be as inclusive as possible to make examples about all and cases about all the whole continent. One of the three speakers today with us, Dr. Alexandre Marc, an associated fellow with our program at IISS, authored an essay on how the Islamist threat on the continent has evolved lately. And this essay will appear in the next armed conflict survey. Second, we will specify what the most consequential responses to jihadist insurgencies on the continent are. And this will be the core of the webinar, talking about the responses in terms of security, development, and negotiations. So we want to explore what the opportunities are for integrating these tools and make the case for mixed integration and show where it has worked and what the challenges are. The third, beyond talking about technical solutions, we need to account for some of the more political issues in terms of the domestic and international challenges to enact such strategies. So we will talk about the geopolitical competition that sees Africa as a fertile terrain for competition rather than competition. Let me now introduce our three speakers. As I mentioned, first, Dr. Alexandre Marc is an associated fellow for conflict, security, and development here at IISS, and he's also a member of the Institute for Integrated Transition. From 2019 to 2021, he was a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution. Before that, he was the chief specialist for fragility, conflict, and violence at the World Bank, an institution which he joined in 1988. Dr. Marc is the lead author of the UN World Bank report, Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict. Welcome, Alexandre. Jonathan Guiffard is a senior fellow at the Institut Montaigne, a graduate of the Institut d'études politiques d'Aix-en-Provence. Jonathan is an expert on international relations and strategic and defense issues in the Sahel and West Africa and the Middle East. He worked for 12 years in French governmental ministries, the Prime Minister, Foreign Affairs, Armed Forces, in crisis zones and has developed an in-depth knowledge of diplomatic issues, asymmetric armed conflicts, and hybrid strategies implemented by states and their adversaries. Welcome, Jonathan. And last but not least, Dr. Yahaya Ibrahim is a senior Sahel analyst with the International Crisis Group. He's a co-founder and research associate with their Sahel Research Group at the University of Florida. Dr. Ibrahim has published extensively on the political and security crisis in the Sahel region and provided commentaries in international media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, RFI, France 24, and Al Jazeera, among others. An alumnus of the Fulbright program, he worked with international NGOs in Niger, including as the executive director of the Niger office of Al-Basar International Foundation. Now, before we start, just some quick logistics and housekeeping rules. So this webinar would last 1 hour. We will have, there is like a button at the bottom of the screen on the Q&A. You're welcome to put your questions at any moment of the webinar, and I will try to relate your question. Now, let's get into the substance and start with some remarks on the landscape and the evolution of conflict. So, Alexandre, I'll turn first to you. The jihadist violence on the continent has been on the rise for the last decade, and they have exploded in the last 3 years, driven by the Sahel and Somalia. Between 2014 and mid-2023, violent events by jihadists in Africa have nearly quadrupled. So based on your essay, can you give us a quick overview of some of the evolution of the threat on the continent and some of its current traits? Thank you very much.
Yes, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I'm very glad to be here and with such great participants. So let me give you a few ideas of what I've written in my essay. First, I think that when analyzing the evolution of jihadism in Africa over the last decades, it is essential to consider that there has been major changes that have happened in the nature of jihadist insurrection in most countries in Africa. These insurgencies have become increasingly entrenched in local conflicts, building on local grievances and tension between ethnic groups, communities, and different different groups, armed groups, and other. Most insurgency today have abandoned global or regional objectives, even in large part because of the successful disruption of the international network of collaboration by Western and African actors. The insurgency now must finance themselves locally, and this means increase their extractive activities, their territorial presence, but also their service to the population when they can. This has very important implication on their strategy, and the revolt of the local clans against Al-Shabaab in Somalia show how the extractive pressure of a jihadist group can strongly backfire. Sometimes the ethnic dimension today of this insurgency have become as important as the religious dimension. In the Sahel, for instance, the core of the insurgency and the fighting is carried out today by Fulanis, an ethnic group that has suffered a lot from the drought and climate change over the last decades and experienced major competition for land from local agriculturalists. While the Islamic dimension remains central in this insurgency and respond to a demand of the population, their development is now dependent on a complex web of relationship inside communities and between communities. Territorial control in areas where they can have some support from becomes central, as it is the only way they can finance themselves. Of course, they still claim affiliation with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but these affiliations are not as important as it was 10 years ago, especially because they bring little money and support from the outside. These affiliations are still influencing jihadist group strategies, however, with ISIS-affiliated groups privileging violence and terror, while Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups are much more pragmatic and adaptive. This being said, the situation varies quite considerably from areas to areas. And there are basically 5 large hotspots in Africa for jihadist insurrection. The deadliest at the present time is the Sahel, and the concerns principally Mali and Burkina Faso. In these 2 countries, the situation has worsened over the last 2 years. In Mali, since French troops and UN troops have left, large territories are now under control of jihadist groups, especially JNIM, and they have tried to infiltrate with limited success in border countries. However, the situation in Niger has somehow improved and in large part stabilized. Niger had put in place very interesting mixed approach to answer the jihadist threat. Of course, what the recent event in Niger would tell us whether this can still hold into the present circumstances. In the Lake Chad Basin, and particularly in Nigeria, the situation has not worsened in terms of attack over the last 2 years. However, the level of violence remains very high, and there's an overall deterioration of the security situation due to banditism, kidnapping, and cattle rusting for ransom. In fact, banditism and jihadism are now mixing in a way that is extremely deadly. In Somalia, there is some good news with the loss of grip of Al-Shabaab that is facing a major push from a well-coordinated effort by clan militias, the Somali National Army, federal and state force, and of course the African Union transition mission in Somalia, but that is decreasing its size now. They are also supported by special force from Western country. Despite important territorial gains made by militias and the government since 2002, Al-Shabaab fighting capability is considerable, and they are concerned that it maintains the ability to strike. And actually, there has been recent evidence that now they've moved into the border area with Kenya, where they are attacking security and civilian force. The critical issue here is how to reestablish a positive state presence of the Somalian government in the area liberated from Al-Shabaab. The 4th hotspot is northern Mozambique. The sub-region saw a recrudescence of militant activity in rural areas in 2022. After a decrease in violence following the 2021 intervention by Rwandan and South African troops in support of the Mozambican army, they managed then to push the militant from major city in the oil region of Cabo Delgado, but the insurrection is still rampant in the countryside. Finally, there's still a presence of particularly violent group in eastern DRC and northern Uganda, which is affiliated to IISS and benefits from the turmoil in eastern Congo. And this situation can evolve now extremely differently, depending on the local dynamic and local conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandre, for this very brief and succinct but essential overview of the 5 main hotspots region in Africa. And I hear your point about this entrenchment and this mixing of jihadist violence with into local dynamics. Ibrahim, let me turn to you. The Sahel, which is the region that you focus on, has quickly turned, as we just heard, and as we know, into the epicenter of jihadist violence, not only on the continent, but we can probably say globally. What are some of the main drivers of insecurity in the region, with specific reference to some of the jihadist group, and how has this threat evolved and become so bad in the last 3 years? Over to you, and welcome, Ibrahim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and for participating in this very important webinar. So let me just give a very brief overview of how the threat has evolved. The crisis in the Sahel started 10 years ago in 2020, in 2012 in northern Mali. And over the last decade, the jihadist insurgency or threat has expanded territorially to come to central Mali, the border between Mali and Niger, to northern Burkina Faso, to western Niger, and now we are talking about jihadists expanding to the countries of the Gulf of Guinea, including northern Benin, northern Togo, and there's a significant threat of jihadist presence in northern Ghana. Already there are attacks on northern Cote d'Ivoire, etc. So the story of jihadist involvement is that of a group that is extending its presence and its geographical influence over a large territory in West Africa. Now, not only the jihadist threat has expanded, violence has intensified. In the shadow of jihadist presence, other forms of violence evolved, including intercommunal violence. And the intercommunal violence has been significantly more deadly than the jihadist violence itself. And this came as a result of communities trying to respond to jihadist violence, organizing themselves, creating militias to respond to jihadist violence against them. And then that led to, communalization of violence with some of the communities that are not part of the jihadists accusing other communities, including the Fulani communities, as being those who are involved in this violence and then responding to that. And that has created a really massive amount of violence in central Mali, in northern Burkina Faso, in northeastern Niger, etc. Third, the jihadist violence has also instigated a political instability in the region. The failure of the state in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso to respond to the jihadist violence has led to a significant amount of discontent in urban cities, and we saw over the last 2-3 years a significant amount of protests in capital cities and in urban areas that decry the government's inability to solve the problem. And this has led to the coups that we saw. Two coups in Mali in 2020 and 2021, 2 coups in Burkina Faso last year, 2022, and a coup in Niger this year. So, I mean, the jihadist insurgency has really, created a huge instability across the region, and this is something that we will be suffering for the next few years to come.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I hear your point is that the jihadist violence, in a sense, created more intercommunal violence at the bottom and at the local level, while at the same time also creating that political instability that then led to eventually to the coups, to urban dissatisfaction, protest, and coups. Jonathan, what is your take on the progressive escalation of jihadist violence on the continent and the fragmentation of security? What has some of your research highlighted on these topics?
So thank you for having me. I totally agree with the overview we just had. For me, the main issue remains the Sahel currently. I'll come to that just later, but I think it's the biggest hotspot on the continent. Somalia remains a stronghold for jihadists, so it's important because there is a good dynamic against them. Still, I think it's going to be a challenge to deal with the jihadists in Somalia, because it's a really well-rooted, locally entrenched, and a very old insurgency. And it's probably the first case of Al-Qaeda managing its new approach of building a political and a social approach, building a project rooted in the population. And I'm glad that Mr. Marc mentioned the DRC, because there is an insurgency in the eastern part of the Republic of Congo, and it's probably the least followed crisis. But it remained very important because there is strong links between these people and the people in Mozambique, and just for that matter, and the fact that they started to do attacks in Uganda, in capitals, in cities, I think everyone will say, okay, another armed group in DRC. but it's not really the usual armed group we saw in the area. So it's important now that they are under the allegiance of ISIS. For Sahel, for me, Sahel is the main problem currently for one reason, is that like the jihadi in Sahel, they, for the first time, they have like weaker forces against them. When you had the French military and the ally, the French military did not manage to deal with the jihadists. Of course, we can see that now, but they were stronger. So the jihadi has to adapt their tactics, has to do some asymmetric battle and things like that. Now they have like the Malian forces, the Burkinabe forces, the Nigerian forces, and Wagner against them, and they are not better at like fighting. So for the first time, they have a victorious dynamic with them. So it's really problematic. Three key factors for me are really problematic and explain the situation. The legitimacy of the jihadists is rising in Mali, in Burkina. They are recruiting because of the tactics used by the Malian forces or the Nigerian, the Burkinabe forces, and they are rationalized. Mr. Ibrahim mentioned the militia, mentioned the communities setting up like people to defend themselves, but these are very bad dynamics, and it's helping the jihadists to recruit more and more and to receive legitimacy, especially for the Fulani community mentioned by Mr. Marc, but not only for the Fulani. It's the case for the Tuareg community, for the Arab community in northern Mali, and for different like communities. The second key factor would be that JNIM appears less radical than ISIS now. So clearly people are considering political negotiation and political discussion with the JNIM, which remain for now Al-Qaeda in Sahel. And we did not see a cut of the Al-Qaeda ties like we saw, for instance, in Syria with Hayat al-Sham, which was Al-Qaeda before and cut its ties with the organization. We did not see that for JNIM yet. So for now, we have to consider that it's still Al-Qaeda and still receiving orders and coordinating with globally, I mean. And the third factor would be that the tension is rising again now between the Malian forces and the Tuareg and Arab rebel armed groups. And this tension is going to be a key factor for the jihadi, because if we have the tension rising again and if we have battles between the Malian forces and between the rebels, the jihadis, they're going to come and they're going to help the rebel armed groups in northern Mali. And by doing that, we are going to have, again, common forces. And so it's going to be very hard to fight the jihadists. So now my last, based on that three key factors and bad dynamics, maybe we can see one thing happening is that the jihadi in Sahel currently have a victorious dynamic. And we're going to have a new step the moment they will maybe take cities or maybe announce again a new Emirates or something like that, because their project is political and we have to keep reminding us that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. A very bleak picture for the Sahel, where I hear you saying that the jihadists are now facing, obviously, yes, weaker forces. There are not the international forces supporting the governments. It's just the news of this morning of the killing of dozens of Burkina Faso soldiers and the local militias at the hands of jihadists, and obviously that's a sign that battles, we don't know about the casualties on the other side, but that battles are not going well. And in terms of Eastern DRC, I hope that in some time we would not. Based on what you said about how it is evolving and expanding, that in some time we would not be discussing like something that is happening in the Sahel, with the conflicts becoming more entrenched locally and causing instability. Let's move to a second area and to talk more about the responses to these rising conflicts. They talk about the integration and complementarity between security development and diplomatic tools is not a novel topic. It has been discussed, and it is being implemented in many cases globally by many stakeholders. Yet it is extremely hard to design these mixed approaches. Now, based on on your expertise, I want to first ask each one of you to explain what these security development and diplomatic approaches entail and are. Now, Alexandre, I will first turn to you. You've worked for many years with the World Bank, which is one of the largest institutions when it comes to conceiving development approaches in fragile countries. What do we mean when we talk about development responses to jihadist threats in Africa? Can you give us some examples or some instances about this?
Okay, well, it's obvious that development is very important. We know that a lot of the problems that countries are experiencing are connected to the fact that there's a lot of lack of revenue. I will not talk about unemployment, because in those areas, employment and unemployment are not significant things to measure, very difficult to measure, but the possibility of generating more revenues and especially giving more potential for youth. But it is much too simple to say, you know, security has failed, we have to do more development. Though I think development needs to be rethought in view of what is happening. So first thing, development is always a very long-term issue, right? And you don't do short-term development. And at the same time, in the situation now, you need relatively short-term answers. So you have to be able, when you do development, to balance those long-term to short-term. So short-term might be, you know, a population that is really deprived of water, let's say, and you need to be able to come relatively quickly and provide them the water they need so that they can continue their activity at a certain level and allow, for example, transhumance to resume in certain areas and all that. So these are the more short term, but it has to come in a broader strategy. The second problem I think that we have that is that all the areas where most of the areas, with maybe the difference with northern Mozambique, but most of the areas, you have actually very challenging conditions. Northern Mali, northern Burkina Faso, most of Niger, Somalia, these are places where the challenge of development is huge. Just the natural resources are very challenging for that. You have drought, you have climate change, you have all that. So it's not a simple proposition. Then the third point is that development works with good governance. You cannot implement effective development program without good governance, and donors cannot sustain long-term effective program if you don't have a good overall governance from the government, but also at the level of communities and other. And that's exactly what is lacking in many of those parts where you have the insurgency. So that's another problem. Third, when you already have insecurity, how do you move in doing development? You need to do development in those places hand in hand with security, because you cannot create the basic trust that is needed if you have a very insecure environment. And third time, those community needs to be involved in their development. They need to see what they need at a certain time. And so you need discussion, negotiation, you need engagement. And that's why I think development cannot go without security and diplomacy negotiation at the same time in those situations if you want to succeed. And there are practical things you can do, and it's true the bank has tried it, the Agence Française de Développement has tried it, a number of NGOs have tried it, but it's extremely challenging. It cannot be an immediate and short answer to the problem.
Thank you very much. If I can summarize very quickly, there is the short-term versus long-term dilemma, the fact that development in a fragile area has to be part of a broader strategy, that it is very hard to do development in many of these areas that are very peripheral, hard to reach, where services are difficult to implement beyond the fragility and the conflict environment. And last is that good governance and local ownership is a must in order for development to work and be implemented. Jonathan, can you give us a quick sense of security responses? What have been the most important security approaches on the continent when thinking about jihadism and armed conflict?
Okay, so first, I totally agree on the integrated approach. The security approach is necessary, but by itself, it cannot work. And I think for a few reasons. If I give you the example of the French strategy in Sahel, for instance, the French had a very aggressive security approach. And I mean aggressive because it's the same approach the Americans had in Afghanistan or Iraq, or like doing military operations. So really like fighting the jihadists, not only equipping or training people. So it has impact. It has impact because it led to the destruction of the large part of the leadership of this group. It helped to disconnect this group from the global networks and the global terrorist approach. It helped to reduce the threat against the capitals, against the foreigners, the threat of kidnapping. But so this security goal, they were good goals, but then the security approach had an impact locally. And so it led the jihadists to shift the strategy toward the local population. So it increased the violence because they tried to avoid the battle with the French and the battle with the international forces. So they managed to shift the strategy, go to the center, for instance, in Mali, or start new fronts in Burkina, and starting to attack directly local population, kidnap them, ask for ransom, attack the local military, etc. So this is one of the problems. You have impact, but then your action has consequences, and then you have to deal with the consequences because you are focused on one goal and you are not seeing that something is changing on the ground. And it's for me, it's one of the main problem of the security approach, because there was an impact in northern Mali, and then the problem became bigger in central Mali and Burkina. And then we have to adapt, but it was like too late for the French military. One of the goals, for instance, is the fact that Al-Qaeda tried to get a reach in Libya, and the security approach managed to stop that ambition. And we see, and that's very interesting because we see in Algeria and we see in Libya a very strong military reaction, a very strong military response, and it had impacts. Clearly, it helped, and these countries are on the good track for the jihadi purpose, I mean. But because it is not only a security approach, it's a strong approach, and then you have to add negotiation, discussion, inclusion, political inclusion, which is probably one of the main issues. And my third point would be that the French security approach in Sahel managed to open two political windows. The first political window was like for the negotiation between Bamako and the armed group of northern Mali. It helps this discussion. It helps the Algerian diplomacy to implement and to manage to gather these people around the table, and brought the Alger Accords of 2015. The problem is then you have a political window open, but if the participants in the negotiation do not negotiate willingly or do not compromise, it's non-effective. And the second political window is that, like, by putting pressure, military pressure on jihadi, especially on AQ and Al-Qaeda, you had this merger of the groups into the JNIM, and the JNIM starting to ask for negotiation with the Malian, not with the French, of course, with the Malian people. But in a way, they were explaining that they are currently under pressure, so they want to have this political discussion with Bamako, and so it's another political window. But then if you don't take the opportunity to use that window, you don't have any effect. And that's why I think the security approach is just one tool, but it cannot work by itself.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I find very interesting your point about the drawbacks of a security-first approach, referring to the French in the Sahel, and it makes me think about the theory or the concept that has been advanced about these unwinnable wars. You can have important impact, as you said, in targeting the top leadership, reducing the threat to the capital cities, weakening the groups, and cutting ties with international actors. But at the same time, you're creating implications at a more local level, and you are in fact not able to win the war just with these with a security first approach. You're not able to win this type of war. I think that's a very important point. Ibrahim, let's turn to the third type of approach, the negotiation and the dialogue. What are some of the types of dialogue that have taken place in the Sahel, and that I'm sure that you have worked directly on, and who has conducted these dialogues? Give us a sense of this. Thank you.
Well, I agree with everything that I heard, and the idea of dialogue came as a result of the failure of the military intervention that all the countries, I mean, efforts not only by France, by the international community, but also countries themselves invested heavily in trying to upgrade their military capability so that they could fight the jihadists, pledging that they could defeat the jihadist groups militarily. That has not worked, as I mentioned, jihadists are there, are expanding, are evolving to becoming even a bigger threat from them. The development solution also did not work. A lot of countries or the international community came up with the idea that this is about poverty, and we need to address poverty at the local level. The problem is that there are already jihadist groups already occupy places in those countries, and it is extremely difficult to implement development projects in areas that are controlled by those groups. And even when you get to implement them by negotiating with the jihadists, the legitimacy of those work and development programs that you implemented goes to the jihadists rather than the state or the actor that implemented them, because the jihadists are the ones that allowed those development projects to happen. And they use that to show to the local populations that they are trying to do good to the local populations. So the development project also did not. At the end, there was one tool that was like a political solution, because even in terms of even if you want to implement development project in those places, you have to negotiate with those groups. And negotiations for a long time has not been explored by neither actors. The government said that we do not negotiate with the jihadists. This is a leitmotif that we hear from Western countries, and that local government, appropriated. But also the jihadists also said that we do not negotiate about guns. We do not bargain about guns. What else are we going to bargain about? But those positions changed starting in 2020. In 2020, in February 2020, the government of Mali came out and said that we are willing to explore the idea. Also willing to engage in those dialogue. But since then, not much progress has been done in terms of political dialogue between the government and the jihadists themselves in Mali. But there are all sorts of dialogue that were going on, including dialogue between the jihadists and the local communities, to try to sort out how are we going to live together, to live under jihadist conditions. So the jihadists will implement things and the local community will go to them and try to negotiate some loopholes and leeways in terms of softening the harsh decisions that the jihadists implement at the local level. You have religious dialogue that is going on between the jihadists and the local religious leaders. You have in terms of the righteousness of the jihadist ideology itself. You have local religious leaders who are debating with them constantly in many areas. You have negotiations between the jihadists and the humanitarian actors to negotiate access to areas that are under jihadist control. And you increasingly have local dialogue that are coming between armed militias and the jihadist groups to try to come to insulate the local communities from the conflict. So both saw how the conflict has created huge violence that none of them is really happy with. So they decided that we will discuss among ourselves to try to take the communities out from the conflict. And this is a fight between us and the government, or between us and the local militias from other communities. These local dialogues have really proliferated a lot in central Mali, in northern Burkina Faso, in eastern Burkina Faso, and it has helped to create a lot of, to lower the tension, to soften the level of violence in those places. But that has been temporary, and it has mostly gone to the benefit of the jihadists, because at the end, the jihadists are the ones who impose the rules of those negotiations. There were a few direct political dialogue between the government and the jihadists, and that happened in Burkina Faso between 2019 and 2020. And during that dialogue, the government negotiated, the elections, the jihadists to let the elections happen, and also to convince the jihadists to let some of their members who want to withdraw from the group to do that if they want to. And that has led to many jihadists coming back from the front lines to reinsert themselves within the populations. We also saw a significant amount of dialogue between the Nigerian government and the Islamic State and Geneva also in the country, and that has led to a significant amount of love. But all these have really produced temporary and localized results. And in all the cases that I mentioned, there haven't been political dialogue in the sense of trying to make compromises on both sides. On the government side, to make compromise on the jihadist demands, and on the jihadist side, to make compromises on the government side. That is still yet to happen, but I think there is increasingly an awareness between all the actors that this conflict is not going to end militarily anyway. At some point, there will be a need to sit and discuss some of the issues that the jihadist insurgency has brought to the table.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Very, very interesting. I hear so that there has been a lot of activities in terms of dialogue, but that mostly has been fragmented and disconnected. And while it has brought local results and temporary and localized results, at the same time, there is not an overall strategy, and the actors are not ready to really give concessions and talk about an end to the conflict. So sort of like there are mixed results. Now that we have established some of the parameters, let's talk about some of the tools and the opportunities to bring these three together. So Alexandre, what do we mean to have a more integral and holistic approach when thinking about jihadist violence? And is there a right mixed approaches, or is it the context that drives a lot of the opportunity for mixed responses?
Well, I think the context has to drive it, but then you need some level of governance and some level of institutions to be able to do that. There's an institution I'd like be interested to see the opinion of Ibrahim on that, but the High Commission for the Consolidation of Peace, for example, in Niger, that for me is an extremely interesting concept that, in my view, has given quite a lot of good results on the old conflict with the Tuaregs, but also now has given some interesting impact also on the jihadist insurrection. This is an institution that is bringing military developers and actually politicians together in one institution that goes and outreach to communities that are affected by conflict. And they can, for instance, when I was at the World Bank, they would outreach to the World Bank and said, you know, we're negotiating with this community. Really, their problem here is the water, and we need to be able to do a relatively rapidly well for the cattle, and we are negotiating at the moment. Would you be able to bring rapidly something like that as we are negotiating? And indeed, it was possible because there was a project that was doing just that, to be able to provide the funding to do that and the technical expertise while they were discussing. But because they had the military on their board, the military could also make sure that their own actions at the place where the negotiation was happening was not contradicting what is happening. Now, Ibrahim will probably have a much better knowledge about how this works, but when I interacted with them and when I saw what they were doing, I thought that that was an extremely interesting approach in terms of an institution that can bring those different dimensions in. Because very often, whether you talk about development and military and negotiation, these are different groups, different institutions, different ministries that do those things, and they don't communicate, you know, and the World Bank is very uncomfortable of talking to the military, and the military are uncomfortable to talking to the politicians, and so on and so on. So you have those traditional idea that these things have to be disconnected, you know, that politics cannot be linked to development, that development has to be disconnected from the military because the military can do all sorts of things that we don't want to recognize. And with this, you never come to the reality of that you have to talk about those three things together in a very concrete way. So these are I think for me this type of institution would be a way to go, and this type of dialogue would be a way to go. But it's difficult. You need to have a certain quality of governance, a political willingness to move in this direction, and some countries had been more inclined of doing that, and some less. I think Niger had always a tradition of negotiations with the rebels that were stronger probably than in Mali or in other places, and they have succeeded better at some point at doing that. So this varies, but this type of concrete institution that can integrate the three are very, very important, or mechanism to integrate the three elements.
Thank you, Alexandre, for making that example on Niger, and for remarking how the institutional and cultural constraints are actually the one of the main barriers to the integration. Jonathan, what is your take on integrated responses? And also, I know you've recently completed a report on economic and agricultural cooperation as a response to conflicts in the areas. Tell us something about it.
Yeah, so for the integrated approach, I agree with everything that had just been said. I think just for the dialogue, that we should highlight the fact that there is two types of dialogue, and there is all the local dialogues that happen either locally or between fighters and the government, and there is political dialogue. And I just want to highlight the fact that nowhere on the planet, no one negotiated politically on a political level with Al-Qaeda or with IS. Maybe this is the way, maybe this is the path the government have to take. but no one did that. So it's very difficult to consider what would be the bargain and what would be the discussion, because they are they demand a form of governance, they demand to change the governments of states, of norms, of social norms that could be very hard to agree on the government side or on the population side. So just want to highlight that, because this is two kinds of dialogue, and I think that the dialogue directly between fighters and the states, finding compromise, finding a way to reintegrate these people in the society is a better way, clearly a better way than a political one. That's for the first. And so the security approach is supposed to help these dialogues. So that's why I agree with Mr. Marc. These cannot it makes no sense to negotiate with someone who declare a war against you, because the jihadi declare this war against these governments. So it makes no sense not to fight, just to wait, but try to negotiate at the same time. You have to do both. But then, and this is the idea of the report we are publishing during this month, then of course the idea of development, but speaking of development, or maybe speaking just on economical cooperation, and in a broader way, the issue of agricultural development and cooperation in the agricultural sector. Why? Because we highlight the fact that large part of the population who is currently targeting by the jihadists to be recruited are people who are not really included politically and economically. A large part of this population work in the agricultural sector. It's the largest part of the worker in Sahel and in the Gulf of Guinea, because our study work highlight this situation also in West Africa in general. And so we think that probably there is an issue in the sector of the agricultural development. Until the 1990s, maybe 20% of the money the money coming from the Western countries were affected to agricultural development. Policies, direct help, cooperation between companies, European companies and African companies, cooperation between producers, etc., etc. Now it's only 3%, and it has been the 3% since the 20s. So for many different reasons, the states, the West African states, they pursue economical cooperation on other sector than the agricultural one, but it's probably there that you can find the key of long-term development. So maybe, and this is the idea of our report, maybe the Western country, the West, the institution, the World Bank, the IMF, the global institution, but also the Western countries and all the countries that are currently cooperating with West African countries, they have to invest in the agricultural development of these countries. Because in Europe, in the US, in China, in India, there was a lot of international money, and not in Africa. So that's one of the clear problem of the development currently in West Africa.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I look forward to seeing this report, as agriculture is not often a theme that is discussed when speaking about conflict and fragility. Ibrahim, if I may, what's your sense on how to bring security development and negotiation responses together? And also I will add one of the questions from our audience about what are the tools generally used for initiating dialogue between government and jihadists, where I suspect also that there are security and development components there as well. Over to you.
Thank you. So let me just politely disagree with Jonathan about there's no possibility of dialogue. There were dialogue cases in Mauritania that happened. There are dialogue cases in Algeria that happened, maybe in a different context, but those are situations where government emissaries sit down with jihadists, and they talked about a variety of their demands, including the religious demands, etc. Actually, I think the dialogue is possible between the jihadist groups and the government, and actually, some of the compromises may not even be hard to achieve. Particularly compromises, on the role that Islam can play in society. We saw a lot of pragmatism on the jihadist side, particularly when it comes to implementing Sharia from the Jenin side. They have abandoned some of the harsh implementation of the Sharia rule, including cutting off hands or lapidating, etc. And most of the implementation of the Sharia in areas that they control today, whether in northern Mali or in central Mali, came down to implementing things related to family code, etc. Those things that are already a demand from the local communities for a long time. Most of the communities in areas that jihadists control. These are areas that already refer to local qadis, local religious leaders and the religious judges, and to settle issues that concern family, concern land, etc. And coming to an agreement about who should be the qadi and who should implement what jurisprudence of Islam, etc. I think those things may be quite easy to achieve, and the change on local populations' daily life is not going to be that much important. It's not going to produce a significant change. And let us not forget that a lot of countries in the region, including northern Nigeria and in Mauritania, implement some of those rules, and it doesn't really change significantly the local population's lifestyle. So I do think that even in those countries, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, certain areas, particularly those that are already under the control of jihadist groups, those compromises may be quick to achieve. Now, when we say that it is important for countries to add the dialogue tool to the amount of different tools that they use to address this conflict, we're not saying that dialogue should be the only way forward. We're saying that countries may subjugate the other solutions, including the military solutions, to the dialogue solutions, saying that if you jihadists accept to come to the negotiating table and accept certain form of compromises, we were ready to talk. But in terms of other the other sides of your demand that we do not agree on, we will continue to fight until we find settlement. And you can have those kind of agreements, and you can also have agreements about how to insulate the communities from these fights. This is a fight between the government and the jihadists, and it doesn't go beyond that. And the communities are not part of it. And you can have this kind of. You can also have compromises on, as Burkina Faso achieved, that you accept that anyone who wants to get out of this can do that freely. And there are a lot of reports of young people who found themselves embroiled into this conflict and want to get out from it. But the jihadists prevent them from doing that. When in Burkina Faso they accepted people to come back, hundreds of people came back from the front lines. And now, when Niger started this project of engaging in dialogue, you have hundreds of people who withdrew from the jihadist groups and they came back to Niger. You can continue having those kind of discussions and trying to get as much possible people out of those groups. So I do think that there is a lot of benefit that you can get, including by talking about the politics. It's of course the hardest to do, to talk about the jihadist demand, because those demands are very peculiar demands. But I do think that jihadists have proven themselves sometimes to be pragmatic about some of the demand, and you can achieve a certain level of agreement with them on those.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. We have run out of time. We have 1 minute left, and I would like to address this very difficult question from one of our audience members. Do you think that what we are watching with severe violence and destabilization stem from the failure of different development programs applied to African nations in the 60s and the 70s? Typically, the approach adopted was uncharacteristically an ethnocentric paradigm. Who wants to take this question? 1 minute, and then we will close. Alexandre, I'll give it to you.
Well, probably the person who asked the question would know that I would answer, I don't think so. So I don't think so that it has much relations. Africa has gone through very difficult time, and the adjustment had been very problematic, but linking the jihadist insurgency that you see now in some of the countries with the policies of the 70s, for me, is a very long shot, and I don't think there's any proof that can be brought to that. So that's my own personal view on that. But
thank you very much. I want to really thank the three of you. This has been a very interesting discussion. I want to thank our audience for connecting. There will be a recording of this webinar within the next 24 hours, and a goodbye from us.
thank you.
Thank you very much.